New thing.
Mhm.
Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us, whether you are live or watching the recording. We're really happy to have you with us. And we're really excited about today's conversation. I'm not going to say a whole lot, but I am going to, I'll say I'm Gabi Conacher. I am a DEE mother and co-founder of Wishes for Elliot and Deep Connections. And today we're really looking at what's happening with epilepsy care. Where are we? Have we made progress? We recently had the Curing the Epilepsies meeting, which happens every 7 years since 2000. And, there was a lot of talk about how we have not come very far since 2000 in terms of epilepsy, in terms of outcomes for patients. So we're going to talk a little bit about why that is, what some of the barriers are, how we can all work together. And we'd love to hear from folks joining us as well about how they felt about the epilepsy care that their child has received. So let me go ahead quickly and introduce folks. So we've got Dr. Dan Lowenstein with us. He is the Executive Vice Chancellor and Provost at University of California, San Francisco. And he is a very well-known and highly decorated clinician scientist who studies basic science and clinical aspects of epilepsy. And he's done a lot of the really seminal work around epilepsy and the genomes, excuse me. And he's also been incredibly collaborative in the epilepsy and genetic spaces, and has won many awards for being a great teacher. And he's an incredible storyteller, which you'll hear today. And then we have Laura Lubbers, who is the Chief Scientific Officer at CURE Epilepsy. And she has spent many years advocating for and helping advance the understanding of epilepsy. And I think it's really important to have the perspective of somebody like Laura, and who is not just advocated and pushed and helps, us learn more, but also someone who has lived this with her sister, who lived with TSC for many years. And then finally, we have Brandy Fureman, who is the Chief Outcomes Officer at the Epilepsy Foundation. And Brandy has worked there since 2016 and is been an incredible advocate. She was one of the first people we went to when we found out about Elliot's rare epilepsy. And that's back when she was with NINS, but has really helped push things forward in her time, both at NINS and at the Epilepsy Foundation. And we're really excited to get this conversation going. Joining me today to kind of co-host, and because of her extensive experience in advocating for and working in this space, is Jada Hecker, co-founder of Wishes for Elliot and Deep. And today is going to be very conversational. So it's just us talking and thinking out loud, and hopefully you all joining in with us. So I did not put this up, but so people can see that they're in the right place, hopefully. This is the webinar we're having now, in case you're in the wrong place, right? And I'll hand it over and just let the conversation get started. So Dan, do you want to start us off with some of your thinking?
Sure. Thanks, everyone. And viewers should know that the people that you're looking at right now include a collection of very close friends. So Laura and Brandy are two people that are truly close friends of mine, and I think we all agree. Jada and Gabi are newfound friends in our circle. So this really is meant to be a conversation of among 5 people, with those of you who are viewing, to consider the question that was posed to all of us, which is, how effective is your epilepsy care? in thinking about the question, um, uh, as a doctor and a scientist, my sort of immediate response is not good enough. It's just we fall so far short of what it is that we want for our loved ones, our children, our spouses, our partners, other people in our family, and as a doctor, for the patients that that we serve. So I wanted to get across a concept, a theme maybe that we'll use during this hour that I've already shared with Laura and Brandy and Jada and Gabby. And that is this, it's a concept of what are called knife edges. And I don't mean literal edges of like kitchen knives. I mean knife edges, which is actually a mountaineering term. A knife edge on a mountain is the meeting point between two steep slopes that you've seen oftentimes in pictures of mountains. Maybe some of the ones in my background might look like that. And those slopes are formed by opposing forces, opposing geological forces. And if you try to climb a mountain along that edge, which is called a knife edge, it can be very, very challenging, but it actually is maybe the only way to get up the peak because the slopes are so steep. And so mountaineers learn to understand that the knife edge is the path. And even though it may fall away thousands and thousands of feet on each way, in each direction, and even though it seems incredibly narrow, it is navigable if one keeps one's focus and recognizes that this is the route, this is the path. So with that theme in mind, there are three sort of concepts that connect to this. I'll just go over them briefly. The first has to do with the challenge of handling being able to take care of people living with epilepsy here, now, today, versus wanting to try to cure epilepsy forever over the long term. And that's the challenge of providing care today versus doing research. And this brings to mind a great story. I heard this actually when I was a medical student many years ago. And the stories of two friends, two doctors. They're walking along on a Sunday morning along a path alongside a river. They're really good friends. They do this every week and they catch up on what's been going on in their lives. And they're chatting away. It's a beautiful morning. And they hear this sound of someone screaming in distress. And they can quickly see that there's someone drowning in the river coming around the corner in the current. One of the doctors immediately jumps right in, swims over, pulls the person out, resuscitates them, and they send them off to the hospital. And the two doctors continue their walk up the path, chatting away. And of course, a few minutes later, yet another scream for help. There's someone clearly drowning coming around the corner of the river. The same doctor jumps in, swims, pulls the person out, resuscitates her. And again, they continue their walk. And of course, a few minutes later, another scream for help. So child drowning. The same doctor, as she's about to jump into the water, sees her friend running away in the opposite direction, going up the path. And she says, listen, I'm going to need your help with this one. I'm exhausted. Where are you going? And her friend says, I'm going upriver to find out why these people are falling in the first place. That story for me just sort of tells it all, because we need both. We need the doctor who is going to jump in and take care of every single patient who comes in and do the best job of applying what we currently know out there about everything possible about the world of epilepsy and apply it to that person. But in equal amount, we need to have people who are thinking, why are people coming into the clinic in the first place? Why has epilepsy developed in my child? And the only way we're going to get to that answer is by doing research of all kinds. Everything from the most fundamental research that may not even initially be connected to epilepsy. It's actually just trying to understand how the human brain works. And once we know that, figuring out how it can go awry through illness and disease. So that's one knife edge. The other ones I'm just going to hit on quickly, but again, I'm interested in how it might weave into the themes that Laura and Brandy bring up, and those of you who are viewing. The second one is the knife edge, the forces at play to be a good parent. Now, I'm also a parent, and it doesn't matter what your children have gone through. It's an incredible challenge. But when you have a child who has been ill, it makes it even more difficult. And the knife edge is wanting to do everything humanly possible for my child, which is what parents do, loving, caring parents, but at the same time recognizing that there's a limit to how much one can do. And you need to take care of yourself and your other children and your partner and the other people in your lives. Because if you don't take care of those parts of your world, we fail in being able to do everything we can, not only for our child who's living with epilepsy, but the other people in our lives. And the third knife edge is the deepest in many ways. And in earlier discussions, people, Gabby and Jayetta pointed out, detected that there's a certain philosophy that I carry in my life, and it's actually the philosophy of the Buddha. And that's my belief system. And I believe deeply in the proposed truth that life is filled with suffering, that it's essentially an inevitability that all of us will experience if we go through life. And every single one of us, the 5 people that you're looking at and the folks who are tuning in, I don't know you, others, but I'm absolutely certain that you understand the nature of suffering. I can tell you it's happened for me. I've had a profound loss in my own family, losing a child. And I don't want to compare notes on what it's like to have a loss. They're all important. They're all profound. They all have deep meaning for each one of us, but it's part of life. So the knife edge here is, how do we handle the ever-present existence of some aspect of suffering? And the answer to that is our capacity to love. And I don't know about you, but if I didn't have love in my life in its many forms, life would not be worth living. And so to me, that's one of the most profound knife edges of being able to find some sense of acceptance that these two forces, suffering and the capacity to love, form this knife edge. And it's that path that we try to walk that balances those two, that allows us to have a fulfilling life. So I ended up, those are my opening comments, rather philosophical, I understand. But I'm hoping we can weave them in as we have this discussion about how to make epilepsy care more effective. So I'll turn it over to Laura or Brandy.
Dan, my friend, I always hesitate to follow you because you are a great teacher. But you know, your comments struck for me some reminders of the idea that we have always looked at taking care of people in the here and now and research as two separate things. And you brought them together kind of at this knife's edge. And one of the things that I'm frustrated with in the way our system of care is organized right now is that those are two very separate things. How we take care of a person and what we learn from that individual person's experience is separated in most cases from any rigorous research to learn about what is working best. And so that's one of the things I'm really frustrated about in our current system. And I want to bring out this idea that there are people who are thinking about different ways to organize healthcare so that we can actually start learning from what happens in your regular doctor's visit and learning over time as you see more and more patients and you see more and more outcomes, how we can take that information and turn it into something that will help us treat the next patient with a little bit more wisdom. Mm-hmm. And those approaches are called learning healthcare systems. So I just wanted to bring that out as one ray, for me, a ray of hope and something that I'm dedicating a lot of time and effort, and many people are beginning to try to organize themselves into this approach for an epilepsy learning healthcare system. both in pediatrics, there's a pediatric learning healthcare system, and for pediatrics and adults, the epilepsy learning healthcare system. And it's this idea that if we can take the time to capture information about how we are treating individual patients and how they are doing, their outcomes, what types of seizures are they having, how frequent are those seizures, and how is their quality of life? Very important outcome to people with epilepsy, their quality of life. If we can capture that information and learn from it, we can make better clinical decisions for the next set of patients. So that was one of the things that I think about is that new approach to healthcare, and people can be involved in that. Patients and families can get involved in that. The other thing that I think about is we often forget that your health, your wellness is not just about what medicine are you taking, or what surgery did you have, or what device do you have implanted. Your health is also influenced very profoundly by things called social determinants. So those social determinants can be things like, do you have access to medical insurance? Do you have access to nutritious food? Do you live in an environment where your stress levels are unbelievably high all the time? All of those things can affect your health. And so that's another knife's edge for me, is how does your medical treatment come together with your social determinants to have the outcome that you're seeing in your epilepsy care? And epilepsy outcomes can be influenced by both. And I think we don't talk enough about that in the whole care of the person. So those are some of the things that occur to me. And, you know, Dan, you are very good at saying things that stick in people's mind. And one of the things that sticks in my mind is a lecture that you gave at the American Academy of Neurology meeting several years ago, when you talked about the questions that patients have when they come to you. And those questions are, why do I have epilepsy? What treatment is best for me? And what does it look like long-term for me? What's my prognosis going to be? And those are questions that for most people today, we really can't answer. And I think, you know, we as a community need to start coming together to figure out, how do we answer those questions for more people so that we can get better treatments to more people more of the time. So Laura, I'll turn it over to you, because I know you've got some great points to make too about new research coming down the pipe.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Ooh, is that okay?
Mm-hmm.
Is there a funny echo? Okay. It's great to be here. It's great to have this discussion with some of my most favorite people in the world to talk about something that we're so passionate about. And we'll echo that, you know, we all agree that care is not adequate. There's a long way to go to make it such, but there are people thinking about it. I've experienced this in my own life. My family has been impacted by epilepsy. In fact, my mother has late onset epilepsy that was diagnosed a couple of years ago and may be caused by immune factors. We're not quite sure. And my sister, who's already been mentioned, who had tuberous sclerosis complex and died last year after a 56-year long battle with epilepsy. And in that time, I've seen significant progress in overcoming some of the challenges of complex epilepsy disorders like the one my sister had, and have seen other advances that are meaningful to people with epilepsy, like increased diagnostic rates based on genetics, potentially revolutionary treatments that are coming forward based on basic research. But there's still so much to understand and to prevent and treat rare and catastrophic epilepsies and all forms of epilepsy. And I think to tag on to Dan's knife edge around suffering and love, sometimes that love is converted to passion. And I think that that's something that we all share in this, is a passion to make it better for people based on the knowledge that we can gather today. This is so essential to driving change faster, accelerating the research. We really need a concerted effort around this. And important key factors to driving advances is understanding the causes of epilepsy, this very early stage research that Dan has already mentioned. There are many potential causes of epilepsy, including genetic and even acquired causes. For example, epilepsies that arise following a head injury, or hypoxia, which is a lack of oxygen in children and as well as adults. These can cause epilepsies. And in fact, there can be an interaction between genetics and environmental factors. And we need to understand these factors. Who's at risk for epilepsy and what do we do to help them? So a better and broader understanding of the diverse causes of epilepsy can help us think more strategically about how to develop appropriate preventative strategies and targeted treatments, hopefully with fewer side effects than many of the treatment options that occur today. We really do need to have more strategy around what it is we do as an epilepsy research community. This really means diving into and understanding different patient populations as well. Through natural history studies, there are many going on in the community, and they can take time and energy for families to participate in, but they are really important for understanding the sequelae, what happens to somebody with epilepsy. And this also feeds into hopefully the learning healthcare systems and capturing information about people as they move through their journey, and then using that to improve the quality of care down the road. It's also important to invest and drive in research that aims to develop what we call biomarkers that can help indicate whether a treatment is effective and faster than maybe waiting to just monitor seizure frequencies. We really need to think about ways to accelerate the research, and biomarkers is one way to do that. Biomarkers might also help us to understand and predict the onset of epilepsy in some cases, whether it's an early onset epilepsy in children or in adults who have suffered a head injury. We need to understand these and use these as preventative strategies. So hopefully, maybe these are new words or concepts, but they're all important in driving and advancing epilepsy research to better outcomes. But seizures are not the only issues that need to be addressed. We also need to advance research on the key symptoms of epilepsy that are associated with seizures, such as cognitive challenges, autism, depression and anxiety, among others. And depression and anxiety, not just for the person impacted by epilepsy, but the family members who also suffer significantly, as Dan has mentioned, as the suffering is there and it can be a lifelong suffering. So being mindful, finding ways to manage that and finding ways to get support, whether it's through your physician networks or community, recognize that it's a real need for us as a community. There's a high percentage of depression in people who suffer with epilepsy and their family members. And this is often overlooked or has been. So we need to be thinking about this, studying it as a means to find effective ways to treat it and manage it. And while there's been much research done on these topics already, it's, as has already been mentioned, it really hasn't translated to improved outcomes for people with epilepsy. So we need to invest into learning how to translate these advances in basic understanding to improved healthcare delivery. And this is its own form of research, which we need to invest in, we need to be aware of to make those transitions happen. As Dan has said, there are different ways to approach the problem, but we need to work at multiple levels and systems as patients and caregivers, researchers and clinicians to insist on change at all levels in order to really be effective. This can take the form of supporting more epilepsy research by advocating for funding. And I know that this can be a scary concept for people. It was for me when it was first introduced to me, but it's incredibly important to share with policymakers, your local congressperson, the challenges that you face and your family faces, to make sure that they're aware and they can say, I've heard this story and I can help by supporting legislation or supporting more funding for epilepsy research. It's so hard because as parents and caregivers, everybody is exhausted and busy, but it's important to be vocal and visible about the challenges that families face when they're dealing with epilepsy. We as a community also need to insist on that more comprehensive care that complex epilepsy syndromes require. It really does. We need this integrated care so that when the epileptologist is giving advice, it's not contradicting another specialist who has a different treatment plan. And this is something that's still too infrequent today. That needs to be improved on. We also need to, of course, work on the stigma of epilepsy and reduce that stigma of epilepsy. There was a time when people were afraid to talk about diabetes. Can you believe it? There was a time when people were afraid to talk about Parkinson's and Alzheimer's disease because there was stigma attached to that. But through sharing challenges and actively advocating for change, these disorders are widely recognized and financially supported for research. So there are opportunities to share our voice to drive transformative change. And certainly there are groups that are actively advocating for more support at the federal level. You can do it yourselves. And I'm sure, if you want to reach out, we'd be happy to give guidance on how to do that. It's really fairly simple. And I know the Epilepsy Foundation has some great programs as well, and maybe Brandy can share some of that.
Sure, thank you, Laura. We do make advocacy a high priority in the Epilepsy Foundation and have for many years. And we've got a great both grassroots and now called grass tops efforts to get to Capitol Hill, to get into the ear of people in Congress and in the administration, how important their support for epilepsy care and research really is. So if you'd like to join any of those efforts, I invite you to come to epilepsy.com. There are links to sign up and be part of those efforts. We have newsletters. CURE also does a number of action alerts and legislative activities. We together as a whole community, no matter which epilepsy organization you want to participate with, we all together need to send this message that there is an urgent need in the epilepsy community and that there is opportunity in the epilepsy community that funding can help convert into better outcomes for people. So we need your voices, and we're here ready and waiting to work with you to help you tell your story.
Yeah, and I'll hold for a second. Oh, sorry, just that I was going to say that the stories are so powerful. And I think, I think back, I just recently saw a tweet from good friend Dr. Perry down at Cook Children's about delivering a diagnosis of Dravet Syndrome Foundation to a 5-month-old child and their family. And he finally felt like there's something I can give this family with this diagnosis, some hope, right? I mean, when we got Elliot's diagnosis of SCN8A in 2014, we were handed one article and said, this is all we know, and we don't know much, right? And so just to be hit with that brick wall of like, literally I Googled, Elliot's condition, and there's like no results. The internet doesn't know what you're talking, doesn't exist. And so using the power of those stories helps to push things the way Dravet syndrome has done, the way, TS Alliance, EF. And I think about also like the little lobbyists who I've done some work with in the past too, right? When we were at the threat of losing coverage from the Affordable Care Act, they brought their children out. They told their stories. They showed up on the Hill. And I can only imagine if the 1 in 26 people who will develop epilepsy in the United States, right? And the people who love them or care about them, if they showed up on the Hill, epilepsy is so prevalent. The impact of something like that, and certainly not everybody's going to be able to do that, but I think you talked about this togetherness. I heard several people saying, right? It's not going to happen, with just CURE's work and just Brandy's work and, at EF and just like the research. We've all got to come together to make this happen and find a unified voice that's saying, this is what we need, and ask the right people to do it and push them to do it. Right. Sorry, Dawn, I think I interrupted you. Yeah.
Well, I'm in complete agreement about the importance of investing in the research to make advances. Just to give a bit of a historical context of, where I believe we are in 2021. Let's look back at another completely different type of disease that was called consumption in the 19th century, affecting, well, people weren't entirely clear what its manifestations were, but clearly the lung was involved. And, you know, I'm a neurologist, so I'm a little bit biased in what I'm about to say, but the lung is a heck of a lot simpler than the human brain. But so, but at that time in the mid 1800s, there was the germ theory of disease, but no one really had any idea what the cause of consumption, or what we would now call community acquired pneumonia. No idea. So going back to Brandy's point about the questions that we ask our doctors, you know, what's wrong with me? With consumption, people just had these theories, but no one actually knew which germ was involved, let alone any treatment. I mean, the treatments were things like maybe even using the material that the body was making in response to an infection, like what we call pus, to actually treat other infections, believe it or not. So it took the application of the microscope and the identification of different stains and biochemistry to eventually discover that, oh yes, indeed, there's this organism called pneumococcus that causes a community-acquired pneumonia. But there still weren't effective treatments until, of course, Alexander Fleming's famous experiment, which produced penicillin in the third of the way into the 20th century. So there you go. That's whatever it is, a 90-year expanse between an illness in which we couldn't say what the cause was, to then knowing what the cause was, and then being able to answer the second question is, can you help me? Can you give me a therapy? Absolutely, yes. Take this antibiotic. And it even went further, right, Brandy? The third question is, what does my future hold? What does my future hold? And if someone had pneumonia and they were treated with an antibiotic, we as doctors would say, you're going to be better in 2 weeks. Just take the antibiotics as we prescribe them. So, you know, that's what we dream of in epilepsy. And we have made amazing progress in certain areas. And the one that was just referred to is a great example. 15 years ago, an infant with a very severe form of epilepsy, such as what we call infantile spasms, we would not be able to describe why that child had their diagnosis in at least 90% of the cases, certainly if they didn't have any kind of abnormality on an imaging study. I'm even being charitable there. Maybe 5% of the time, we might be able to have something identified. Now, at least 50% of all infants with these forms of epilepsy can be diagnosed through genetic testing. 50%. It's actually climbing up to 60. And because of the identification of those genes, which we didn't have 15 years ago, scientists are now developing specific therapies for those targets. And Dravet is a great example of, you know, where we've already got some successes. SCN8A is another example where scientists, they know what they're going for. And it's just a matter of figuring out what the therapy is going to be. So, you know, I look at that and say, instead of 90 years, in the course of less than 20 years, we've gone to the point where we can actually now make the diagnosis, and we're starting to have targeted therapies on hand. So there's great hope. And the last thing I'll say is, and everyone's aware of this, you should be, the underinvestment in epilepsy research is a scourge of our society. It's just terrible. Not to say that investment in other disease types is all important, but there's a tremendous disparity in the amount of funding that our politicians direct towards different disease categories and how prevalent they actually are, and the costs that they have for the individual and society. So we need to do everything we possibly can to increase the amount of funding that's directed towards epilepsy.
Jada, maybe you can talk for a minute. I mean, you've, it was a couple of years ago, I think, Jada read this article by Ann Berg and
Stuart Goldman.
And Stuart Goldman, right, about how comparing, you know, pediatric epilepsy care to pediatric oncology care, and the vast, you know, difference between what those look like. And that was really inspirational for us in thinking about how to act and how to to work towards finding better answers. You want to talk about that for a minute, Dana?
Yeah, it was really a rude awakening, and it was an argument that epilepsy care was at least 30 years behind pediatric oncology. And it just broke your heart that there are ways or mechanisms for communities to have gotten together, to have really joined forces. A little going back to what Brandy was talking about, of gathering the data with each person, not losing that critical information. Rare diseases, we're not going to solve rare diseases by big comprehensive studies. We're never going to have the numbers. We've got to learn from each of the individuals, and that's what some of these learning health systems and part of the structure of pediatric oncology. They just learned, they gathered the data, and they were able to get the evidence. And you know, we've been advocating for this, and Anne and Stuart wrote the article several years ago, and it's like, where's the momentum? You know, Dan, when you were talking about the allegory of the two doctors walking down the river, I mean, one of the questions that came to mind for me is, what are the mechanisms to connect the two doctors? Once one runs up the river and the other one's, you know, out of breath and exhausted and trying to save everyone who's drowning. And I mean, you brought it up yourself. There is this gap between the research and the clinical care. But what it seems so frustrating is that it feels like there are many disciplines, and we all come from different circles, whether it's the clinician side, the research side, the advocacy side, or combinations of those, and family side. But despite the efforts of each of us within our own communities, advocating for bigger vision, bigger change, kind of transformation, it's very hard to mobilize. For us, just working with the epilepsy community, whether it's just the rare epilepsy community or the whole epilepsy community, I mean, that's a battle. Dan, you've been working with clinicians for years. Laura and Brandy, you've been working with researchers. You know, how do we get the kinds of collaboration across these disciplines, within the disciplines, and really get the kind of mobilization Gabi talked about? Boy, if 1 in 26 people in the country started standing up and saying, our care is not satisfactory and the investment is not commensurate with the impact and the refractory nature of epilepsy for so many people. How do we spark the conversations within disciplines, across disciplines, and get the kind of mobilization that they had for AIDS, for disability rights, for pediatric oncology, for Parkinson's, for Alzheimer's? We just don't have it in our community.
There are a lot of
there's a lot there. There's absolutely a lot there. And one of the things that always resonates for me is a quote that comes from quality improvement work. And it's that the system is perfectly designed for the results it achieves. And so if we are not happy with the results that we're getting, either from our research system or our system of care, to me, the answer is finding the right place to change that system. And I think that part of, you know, this whole conversation we're having is a piece of that change, because now we've got people who are embedded in the research world, talking to people who are embedded in the clinical care world, talking to people who are, doing advocacy day in and day out. That kind of close-knit relationships between all of those pieces of the system hasn't really happened before. I think we're coming to a new time in the community when we can come together, no matter what organization you're part of, no matter what perspective you're coming from, you know, as a healthcare provider or as a researcher or as a family member or a patient yourself, you have a place at this table. And we're talking together about how to change this system to make it work better for all of us. So I'm hopeful. It is hard. Absolutely, it's hard. But I do have a lot of hope that we can make a difference. And it's in large part because of people like you all.
Yeah, I was going to pick up on the same thing, Brandy, which is in thinking of the problems that we face, the obstacles that we face now in the 21st century, I actually don't think that it is the challenges of getting people together across these different disciplines and domains. And the reason for that is one word, it's called the internet. So I think, you know, in the world of research, it's been a sea change to now be able to carry out our work, because I mean, many of us, in fact, collaborate with people who are not even in our own home institution when it comes to epilepsy research. And that's true of all across science. So I don't think that that's the obstacle. I think the obstacle is what two areas that we've already talked about. On the research side is we have not invested to the degree that we need to invest to make the breakthroughs. It's simply, the more is better when it comes to putting resources into figuring out the very fundamental nature of the human brain. And you know, I'm sort of fond of sharing with my medical students what sits inside our skull is the most remarkable entity in the known universe. If you want to debate me about that, let's go at it. But can you think of anything that you know of that's more astounding and complex than what's sitting inside our skull? So we're not going to resolve this, even with all the money in the world, over the next couple of weeks. But the more resources we put into it, the more people that we can train from many, many different disciplines who are really, again, there's not a difficulty in bringing teams together, and Laura can comment on this because of the work that CURE Epilepsy is doing. So that's one area. And the other area is fixing a broken healthcare system. Mm-hmm. And that's political will, it's sociological change, and it's resources. I don't know about you, but I think our healthcare system and our public health system leaves a lot to be desired, and I'm being careful in my words there. That's a colossal understatement. And the pandemic has revealed just how the shortfalls, especially when you compare it to many other developing countries. So those are the obstacles, I think, is the resources and the ability to change the depth and the breadth of science through resources and fixing our healthcare system. But Laura, did you want to comment on what you've observed in terms of scientists being able to work across disciplines?
Absolutely, absolutely, yes. So we have some larger team initiatives that bring together basic scientists and clinicians to work together to try to solve problems, particularly right now around post-traumatic epilepsy. And so this is a very large consortium of researchers that are really engaged and review each other's science to try to move it along faster, give their input, the best scientific thinking we can gather to advance the research. There are some silos that continue to exist around data sharing, and those are things that can be and should be fixed. These are not insurmountable challenges to make sure that the data that are collected are well used. But I agree with you, Dan, around the healthcare challenges that we face from an organizational standpoint, if you will, and that the focus is not necessarily on the patient. It's not patient-focused outcomes that we're after, and that needs to be the case. We need to be focusing on patient-centric efforts to improve the outcomes of people who are impacted. And ultimately, this will result in the economic benefits to to the system. Right now, it's just not ordered to be that way, but we know that improved healthcare reduces economic burden and reliance on supplemental support. So if we can change that mindset and think about how do we bring the right people together in medical teams to really advance the treatment care, the care of people to improve the outcomes faster. This will be a benefit. We just don't think that way right now. And that's where political will does come into play.
I wonder if I can ask you, Dan and Brandy, to see if you have similar strategies. Both of you have talked about major gaps or failures in the existing system. Brandy, you were talking, you keep, we have the system that gives the results we have. And Dan, you talked about, the whole healthcare system is broken. So it seems to me the only chance we have to really make a compelling argument about new resources is having a lucid platform of how we make the system better. Can you each talk about what your diagnosis of the problem is and how we can join the articulation of the need for resources with the kind of structural change that's needed? And we all know, we saw the political challenge of getting healthcare through and even having it survive countless efforts to kill it. So to further transform the system, how do we combine the vision of what needs to change so it really brings results for the 1 in 26 who aren't being well served?
Well, Dan, can I take a first crack at that, and then please follow. So Jayetta, one of the gaps that I see is that we have a pretty good pipeline to develop new treatments, right? We know we have the process of working with the FDA to do phase 1 trials, phase 2 trials, and phase 3 trials. And at the end of that phase 3 trial, if there is enough evidence of safety and effectiveness of a new, we'll call it a new medicine, the FDA will review that and will make an approval. And now we have a new medicine on the market. And we know that it's safe and we know it's effective in the population of people who are in that clinical trial. And then it gets released out into the world. And some doctors will pick it up and they will, certainly study all of those results and use that new drug in the patients that they think are most appropriate and are in that indication to use the new drug. Other doctors will say, I'm not comfortable with that so new on the market. I'm going to wait and see and see how that goes before I prescribe that to my patients. There's no system once a drug comes out of those, clinical trials where there's been a couple hundred people exposed to the drug that takes it from that stage into, okay, when should this be used in a regular patient with epilepsy? And there is a kind of research that can be done in that part of the pipeline. It's implementation research, health services research. But we really don't have much of that research funded in epilepsy. There's, there needs to be so much more. And so that's one place where I think there's a huge opportunity for additional funding that goes into epilepsy research to help us understand how do we use these wonderful, terrific, new cutting edge treatments, devices, new surgeries, new medicines, new diets. How do we use those in the broader population? So for me, that's just one example. I'm sure Dan will have others, but I think that's a place where our system has a real gap that could be filled and could help improve outcomes for people.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Two additional areas that are sort of more general across the overall system relate to the decision that we've made as a society to allow healthcare to be a commodity of the marketplace. And because of that, the incentives are clear. The incentives are related to the marketplace. So we have accepted a system, or we're forced to accept a system, which has its own history, in which there is tremendous disparity in access to care. So as everyone knows, there's currently 40 million or so Americans who don't have health care, and others that are at the margin. And that's because of the financial decisions that have been made about the provision of healthcare. And then there's the incentives, for example, about the therapies that we provide. It's outrageous what we allow pharmaceutical companies to do with drugs in order to make a profit. This is not meant to disparage pharmaceutical companies and biotech companies. They play an incredibly important role in the development and the production of effective treatments. But because of our system, we allow them to do things which I think are completely unreasonable and lead to the increased cost of our healthcare system. For example, taking two medicines that we know are effective, that once they've gone beyond their patent, putting them together and combining them and charging 10, 20, 30 times the cost of each individual drug themselves. There's no reason to allow that to happen except to enable companies to make a profit. Now, they'll argue that that's needed in order for them to do the research and development, but we know from other countries, again, in the fully developed world, where their system provides the same level of care for much less cost. So I think those are really big systemic problems, Jada, that we need to solve. I'll just admit my own view, my own bias. I am a deep believer in the single payer system.
Yeah, no, I think, there's so many things that come up about the feed into this, this challenge, right? And I think in terms of, there's a lot of people who are working on this from, like Brandy and Laura and you, Dan, like from this, the advocacy side, the education side, there's people like Jade and I from, the patient caregiver side. And I think that there's people who are really working to try to bring us together more, right? To have these conversations and jointly find problems. And I know that, this group is an amazing group of, epilepsy advocates working in that space together. And I think I want to make sure that what stands out in my mind is thinking about, okay, so on whose shoulders does a lot of this fall, right? When you're thinking about your own child's, if you're talking about the rare epilepsies, your own child's healthcare, and especially around epilepsy and the rare epilepsies, there's so much time that parents spend reading all the publications, asking other families what works, then advocating with their providers to say, can we try this? Let's try this. And I'm also thinking about, surgery, like how it's just very rare that, people get that counseling on whether epilepsy surgery is relevant or could potentially help somebody, or a lot of devices. I feel like we're having to kind of do the homework and look and read and reach out and find out, and kind of, not that that's a bad thing for us to be able to, assess our choices, but it shouldn't have to be, relived every time there's a child with severe epilepsy, to redo all of this. And so I think part of what we also can talk about is what parents can do, right? We don't have to accept the status quo. And, really we should be demanding data-driven care, right? Nothing else in this world, would get approved unless, I'm thinking about, all the checks and balances that go with, so many different sectors, right? That there's always a huge amount of research that's required, right? And I'm not advocating that it take a million years to get treatments together, but what really is the issue is this data, right? So that if I go to the doctor, and I have a fantastic, my son's neurologist is fantastic. He's great and honest and engages in conversations and listens. It's a dialogue, but every medicine we try is just like maybe it'll work. I don't know. I mean, it's like, who knows? And the reality is that for my son, it's been 7.5 years, and I couldn't look back and say, based on the evidence, that seems like this kind of drug worked better because of this, and it needs higher dosing. And I think that there's just such a need to institute a way of gathering this learning, right? And to feel like each of us is contributing to a system that is teaching, maybe it won't help my child, but I don't want anybody to go through this like I have, right? And so we can be advocating to say, I want us to have this opportunity. Don't waste my child's life, my sister's, experiences. I mean, how much have we learned? I mean, I can't even imagine, with Ellen's, many years, right? What could have been learned? So to me, that's a really powerful piece too, is to, and by using our stories, I think is really what does it, right? It's just, that's what tugs at people's hearts and set, and gets people thinking. So I'll take it from there.
It's true that, we have incredible opportunities through the electronic medical records now and things like epilepsy learning healthcare systems that can enhance this and drive the science faster. And so hopefully we can leverage those tools, at least as a start, to keep moving faster.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think, the point I want to add to that is there are incredible barriers to sharing information in the healthcare world. There are also new technologies that are going to make that easier. And those technologies are being implemented right now. So I think we're going to start to see a change in how easy it is to share information that you're comfortable sharing. I think we're going to see a change in how many people want to have their own health data, which you have a right to have. That is gonna change. And as people start to get more involved in how their health data is used in deciding who they want to share that with for research or for additional learning or for developing new products, I think that's going to really change the dynamic of being able to learn from all of these experiences that we've been talking about. But it's been incredibly hard in the past to be able to do that.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think this is an incredible conversation. I think that we can continue it. I mean, I think down the road, we should revisit and keep brainstorming together. And thank you so much to Brandy, Laura, and Dan for joining us. And I think that, this gives a lot of food for thought. We'll continue thinking about this. I know we've already got some movers and shakers trying to keep the wheels turning. And thank you for all you do, everyone.
As we all agreed, inaction is not an option.
It is not.
Absolutely.
We need a plan and we need to do it.
Absolutely.
Thank you, Gabby, and thank you, Jay.
Thank you,
everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, right.
To see you.
Yes,
Thank
we
you.
can.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Take care. Bye.